Hi guys, some of you guys have requested that I do a reaction video on the Law and Crime recent D4VD discussion about the grand jury in an interview that Jesse Weber had. So let's talk about this Law and Crime episode. I wasn't able to go live on it. I'm also catching up on the Diddy documentary. Lord have mercy, I have a lot to say about that, but we'll talk about that in a different video. Okay, so Jesse Weber brings in this attorney who's experienced with grand juries, federal cases, and whatnot specifically. And I really want to get into this commentary about this grand jury and a little bit more details that he's given us about what to expect, what comes next, and also just the ins and outs. So I'm totally here for it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments about this whole situation as we're reviewing this together. Let's go.
Former federal prosecutor, somebody that knows the ins and outs of the criminal justice system, particularly in California. Nima, thank you so much for coming on. I want to take a step back here and explain to us what an investigative grand jury is. How is that different from our understanding of what a typical grand jury is?
Jesse, thanks for having me. Obviously, a sad and fascinating case. And an investigative grand jury can subpoena witnesses and documents, right? That's its function. It can't return an indictment. And I think it's important for people to know that grand juries are not typically used here in California, right? Obviously, I'm a former federal prosecutor. We used to use them all the time. But
he said grand juries are not typically used in California. Hold up. Wow. See, that's news to me. Now, I wanted to search this more, and I was able to pull that California does have grand juries, but they're used very differently than in many other states. So I guess it can be seen as they aren't really used, but they're used differently, whatever that means. So California primarily uses preliminary hearings instead of grand juries. For felony prosecutions, California overwhelmingly relies on a preliminary hearing where a judge reviews the evidence, the defense can cross-examine witnesses, the defendant is present, and the proceeding is public. And this is considered more of a transparent process, right? So a preliminary offers the defendants more rights, and California prosecutors usually prefer them unless there's a strategic reason not to. Well, then that's the question. Why would they just go straight to a grand jury? That would be the question. Now, California law allows prosecutors to seek a secret grand jury indictment for certain cases, especially complex gang RICO style cases, high profile cases, which is, I definitely think that this is the case right here. Police use of force cases, situations where prosecutors want testimony that won't be challenged in public. That might be another situation, y'all. Maybe the two reasons is that you have a high profile case because of the person that, D4VD. And then you have a situation where testimony and evidence could be challenged in the public. That's kind of what I'm thinking. So what I'm gathering here, based on just a little that I pulled, California still has grand juries, but they prefer the preliminary hearing route, which is the standard method of charging for felony. And these grand juries essentially are used for special situations. Just something to think about as we're hearing this attorney speak about.
Can't return an indictment. And I think it's important for people to know that grand juries are not typically used here in California. Obviously, I'm a former federal prosecutor. We used to use them all the time. But in state courts here, they usually proceed by a complaint and a preliminary hearing. There's two ways to get to a felony jury trial, a grand jury indictment or a prelim. And DAs here, they almost always proceed using a complaint and a prelim. So why aren't they doing so in this case? That's the question. I think the reason is they want to lock in some of these witnesses before the grand jury.
That makes sense, right? I personally think that makes sense. They want to lock in witnesses, maybe lock in the information. Maybe there's information or statement that they do not want the public to challenge, okay? I could definitely see this.
Make sure they don't go sideways because they're going to need some cooperators at trial in this case. And that's why the DA's office convened the grand jury. Because if you want evidence, you can probably just get a search warrant. That's much more powerful than a grand jury subpoena.
I have a lot of questions about that. So first of all, right, a preliminary hearing would be public. I'm not saying necessarily cameras, but reporters would be in there. It's open to the public. We would know what the evidence is against defendants. Grand jury proceedings are secret, right? So you make a good point about that. why would they want to keep it secret? Is it, you mentioned before, but is it also they don't want to tip somebody off? They don't want the public, they don't want potential suspects, potential defendants to know what they may or may not have right now? And by the way, defense attorneys wouldn't know about a grant. They can't present evidence. They can't present a defense argument. So they're just waiting to see what comes back. So is that also one of the reasons this could be secret? Maybe secret. We're reporting about it.
Grand juries are supposed to be secret. There are leaks all the time.
Which is what we've seen with the LA Times. There's leaks all the time. They're supposed to be secret, but yeah, we're talking about it, right?
Somewhat critical of this case. Look, I live and work in Los Angeles. I respect law enforcement, but things have been moving at a very slow pace in the Celeste Rivas case. And obviously, I want law enforcement to get it right. I don't want them to rush to judgment. That's a common defense argument. But now we're coming up on 3 months since her body was found. And when it comes to the body, the most important thing to know is it's been returned to the family, right? That evidence is gone.
Again, it's been returned to the family. And I know people, because of what Harvey Levin said on TMZ, well, the coroner has the body. I feel like he misspoke on that clearly, but I don't know, man. It's crazy how he says things, and you do have to wonder, well, where's this coming from? What's the context, and whatnot. Celeste Rivas' body was found on the 8th of September. We are literally approaching 3 months here on the 8th of December, which is Monday. Yeah, it's been this long. Okay.
Whether it's the final autopsy or the toxicology or whatever it is, those investigations and tests should have been done by now. I don't know what's taken law enforcement so long. I don't know why they went the grand jury route, because when you take a long time, witness memories can fade, evidence can disappear, and importantly, suspects can flee.
Okay. This is interesting because he's saying, I don't know what's taking them so long. I don't know. This is what I'm going to speculate. I feel they already know. I feel all of this is being withheld for the grand jury specifically, right? The security hold, the cause of death, all of this, the ability to update the public, the ability to update anybody. All of this is very strategic for this grand jury. That's my opinion. Now, if you follow somebody that I shouted out yesterday, which was Call Your First Witness, a lawyer, he broke down the defense perspective of all of this, which I think is very, very important for a lot of us to understand. A lot of us want justice for Celeste Rivas, but we also have to understand what that defense argument is going to look like. And one of the things he's talked about is like, if you don't have a cause of death on Celeste Rivas, this can, be a way in which a defense argument can happen, right? So I think that that is something that, people should prepare themselves as they're going to be following this case, if that's the route that this goes.
So I don't like the grand jury route, but maybe the DA's office thought, look, we have to convene this grand jury. It's supposed to be secret. I got to get these witnesses to testify now because I might lose that evidence later on.
So he says, I don't like the grand jury route. I honestly think that this is all strategy. I think that prosecutor Beth Silverman knows exactly what she's doing going in this route. Again, this is somebody who has prosecuted high profile, serial killers and all these kinds of cases that have been heavily covered in the media. I think that this is a complete strategy in her part, and maybe a good one, right?
Explain this to me, how it works, what an investigative grand jury does. Because look, a typical grand jury, right, would be presented, that would return an indictment. They're presented kind of like a streamlined case, maybe a few witnesses, maybe an investigator, maybe a victim, and they have to get a majority, right, of the grand jurors that are convened. You think there's probable cause for an indictment and return an indictment. What does an investigative grand jury do? Like, what's their day-to-day? How long are they usually convened? And what's the end result? What do they prepare at the end?
Yeah, so you're right. Typically, you go to the grand jury to get an indictment. So what does that mean? You put on your witness, almost always a law enforcement witness. Usually, it's not a witness that has anything to do with the case because the rules of evidence don't apply. They can present all sorts of hearsay evidence to the grand jury, right? You want someone that's not going to be used as impeachment later on that might say something inconsistent, how they're going to testify at trial. So you have this summary witness that talks about all the evidence in the case, present that to the grand jurors. And like you said, you just need a simple majority. Usually you have 23 grand jurors, and you only need 12 out of those 23 to return an indictment. And the standard is low. Okay, grand jury indictments in a matter of minutes. That was the function of a grand jury, to charge people. So you summarize the evidence, feed it to them in a spoon-fed way, make it easy for them to sign that true bill or the indictment. An investigative grand jury is very different. They tend to go longer because their role is to actually hear the evidence. So obviously on law and crime, we cover a lot of trials. Everyone's familiar with that question and answer format. For an investigative grand jury, it's almost like a deposition, right? You want that witness talking for a long time. So there's the prosecutor, there's a court reporter, there's a witness, and the grand jurors. That's it. There's no one else in that grand jury room. There's certainly no defendant, no defense attorney that's going to cross-examine the witness. So you want to lock in that witness like you would in a civil deposition. Now, some states do allow for depositions in criminal cases, but California is not one of them. So think of
Interesting. Again, let me go back a little bit. So there's a difference, right? If we have an investigative grand jury, which is exactly what the LA Times called this, right? An investigative grand jury, you're looking at something a little bit different. Whereas like a regular grand jury, you got your 23 people and the standard is low. Here you have court reporters, you have different things happening. Hell, there could be, transcripts that definitely comes out of this. And I do wonder, and I would think that at some point, this would be of public review, right? So that we're able to review, well, what did these witnesses say? What did this grand jury look at? That's what we want to know.
prosecutor, there's a court reporter, there's a witness, and the grand jurors. That's it. There's no one else in that grand jury room. There's certainly no defendant, no defense attorney that's going to cross-examine the witness. So you want to lock in that witness like you would in a civil deposition. Now, some states do allow for depositions in criminal cases, but California is not one of them. So think of that grand jury proceeding more like a deposition than actually something that's used to return an indictment. So at the end of the investigative grand jury, they can make recommendations, but they cannot return an indictment. That has to go to a different grand jury.
So are they given at the end of the day, hey, after everything you heard, do you think there's enough to subpoena this witness? Do you think there's enough for a search warrant? And at the end of whatever their session is, they said, do you think there's enough for us to, I guess, present the evidence we have in front of a different grand jury for an indictment? Am I right about what the end of the day looks like them every day?
That's absolutely right. So they would have to go to another grand jury to get an indictment. Again, I'm not saying they would necessarily do that. And normally they would just get a complaint, an arrest warrant, and pick someone up and deal with the prelim. Getting a grand jury indictment in the state court system here is rare. It does happen, but it's rare and it's not typically done, especially in murder cases.
So
interesting. See that, and this is a somebody from California that would have the experience of that. Okay. Now, for those that are saying, well, what is the deposition part? Okay, a deposition, for those that don't know, very quickly, it is a sworn testimony given by witnesses, experts, parties to those cases, and they're doing this under oath. And often it's recorded. There's a court reporter. There's different kinds of grand juries, but in this specific case, we're talking about an investigative grand jury. Let's go back a little bit.
Investigative grand jury, they can make recommendations, but they cannot return an indictment.
And that has been the consensus that I've heard. They can make recommendations. We recommend based on all this that was presented or based on the witnesses or whatever. They can recommend it, but they cannot return an indictment. Okay. I think it's important to make sure we drive that home.
That has to go to a different grand jury.
So are they given at the end of the day, hey, after everything you heard, do you think there's enough to subpoena this witness? Do you think there's enough for a search warrant? And at the end of whatever their session is, they said, do you think there's enough for us to, I guess, present the evidence we have in front of a different grand jury for an indictment? Am I right about what the end of the day looks like them every day?
That's absolutely right. So they would have to go to another grand jury to get an indictment. Again, I'm not saying they would necessarily do that.
My goodness, another grand jury? Lord have mercy. It's like, we don't know if that's going to happen. And clearly they don't know, right? But they're just saying like, this is what the process is. Wow. Okay. And I don't think that that's like, that would be crazy if they felt the need to do that. And for what? But okay.
And normally they would just get a complaint, an arrest warrant, and pick someone up and deal with the prelim. Getting a grand jury indictment in the state court system here is rare. It does happen, but it's rare and it's not typically done, especially in murder cases.
So let me ask you this. Is that because this is complex in a way? Why would it, are there aspects of this where you might be dealing with a confusing state of affairs, cause of death, manner of death, multiple players, high profile nature of this? Why go this alternative route? And by the way, I don't know if it's a murder investigation. There's back and forth of whether or not it's a homicide investigation. What makes this a complex death investigation?
I don't necessarily think it's that complex. Obviously, look, you have a body that was decomposing for quite some time. There's a lot of misinformation out there that might not be true. Obviously, first we heard it was dismembered, then it wasn't dismembered, then it was completely decomposed, then it wasn't, then it was frozen, but maybe it's not. So LAPD is certainly one of the most secretive when it comes to providing information. They repeatedly request any kind of Public Records Act request. Information that comes out is usually leaked. That's just kind of how they do things. They're not very transparent, unfortunately, as a law enforcement agency. And look, and maybe that's
Yeah, they're not very transparent, okay? Just um that can have its ups and downs, and there needs to be a leak and multiple leaks. I don't know, man. This is crazy.
For the good when you're dealing with an investigation like this. But the reason I think this is maybe a challenging case is you got to get into the history between Celeste and David, if it was, or someone else, right? She was missing for a year and a half. We don't know why she ran away. There was some sort of romantic or sexual relationship, how she died. Was she killed? Was it an accident? Was it an overdose? So there's a lot of questions that we don't know. All those questions, Jesse, I don't necessarily think lead us to the grand jury route. What the grand jurors are going to do to answer these questions, these are more questions for detectives and medical examiners and doctors and so forth. But again, I think what the grand jury can do is bring witnesses in, get their testimony locked down so they don't go sideways at trial.
This is my question, because I know that like in the LA Times, it said something to the effect of it, this is the murder that they're looking to charge for murder. I do wonder if based on the witnesses that they have, and again, these witnesses could be, D4VD's friends. These witnesses could be family members of, Celeste. We don't know, right? Or they could be teachers or all these people. I do wonder if it's possible that it's not just murder, but there might be, other SA crimes that they could charge or other things that they could do, that they could be looking at, that based on their communication, or maybe there's other things that have not really been made public, right? Keep that in mind. A lot that what has been made public, not everybody can confirm and substantiate the things that have been put out. And I think we have to be careful when we do that. Like I had somebody send me a whole like Google Doc of all the screenshots. The majority I have already seen and, whatnot, some of which kind of say that he had a relationship with another person. There was like a text message that was leaked and kind of went back and forth with that. And even though a lot of it is a lot of like, wow, alarming, how much of this can we substantiate? It's very likely that these professionals are sitting on information that it's not privy to us. We don't know. We don't know what was on Celeste's phone. We don't know what was captured there, right? I have a hard time believing that a teenager at Celeste's age, especially somebody that was running away and that had been missing for quite some time, would not have a phone or a way in which she was communicating with people or accessing Discord or any of these social media platforms. So it's very likely that there's a lot that this grand jury and these attorneys are sitting on that we're just not privy to.
That is the advantage of a grand jury in a case like this. I think this case is going to rely a lot on cooperators, right? People that were in that inner circle, right? That knew whether it was David who had access to the front of that Tesla or it was someone else, whether they're percipient eyewitnesses. I think that's the evidence the grand jurors are hearing, witness testimony. And the DA's office is thinking, well, listen, I don't want to wait till the prelim, or I don't want to wait all the way to trial. I'm not sure how this witness will present or what they will say, or if they'll go sideways and do a 180. I want to lock them in now. And that's why I'm convening this grand jury.
And that's their testimony. They can't escape from that. The preliminary, by the way, would be in front of a judge to determine if there's enough probable cause to move forward. So different.
This would make sense, right? Just imagine if we're having a very public trial or if we're preparing for the trial, people will change their minds about the things that they say. So, once that testimony's in there, whatever witness it is, they can't change their mind later. It's already on record, right? But people do change their mind a lot. So I think it's a thing that I personally think that this was a smart thing for prosecutor and, those that are in charge of this case to do at this point.
Than a grand jury, other than the secret aspect. By the way, we talk about why there might be a grand jury. This reporting that there was a reference to a grand jury number, if I'm reading it right, in the LAPD's court petition to place a security hold on the ME. Are they right? Does that seem accurate that there's probably a grand jury going on?
I do think there is a grand jury. And again, it goes back to LAPD, right?
Guys, there's a grand jury going on. Okay. I highly doubt that the LA Times would write, and it was two of the writers that would write the article that they would write to them basically say, never mind. No, there's a grand jury going on. Okay. And it looks like it's been going on since like mid-November at this point.
right? I mean, they want to make sure everything is secret and they put a hold on this. Typically, we've talked about it, right? There's a presumption that government records are public, right?
Yes.
Including an ME's report and court filings are public. But in this particular case, they're trying to prevent that report from being released.
Now, interesting how he says there's a presumption that government records are public. That is a very interesting statement that he makes, right? A presumption. We assume that everything that we ask and we're wanting, it's gonna be made public. It's not always like that, right? Because they can sit on stuff for quite some time. They can.
leads me to believe that the report is complete. The investigation should be complete or nearly complete. And the fact that LAPD is putting a hold on it, again, typical for this jurisdiction, but not typical for how other law enforcement agencies elsewhere handle these types of reports.
And to be clear, we don't know exactly how long, if this grand jury does exist, how long it's been impaneled for, right? There's been reporting that since mid-November. Could be before that. If I were to tell you that, there was reporting that there was a search warrant of the house that David was staying at back in September, where certain material was reportedly seized, this rental property, and this rental property was near the Tesla, that doesn't necessarily mean that search warrant was issued by this grand jury, right? That it could have been law enforcement. It could be separate, right? So even though there were developments in this case, or seeming developments, doesn't mean it was coming from the grand jury. It means it was maybe from law enforcement.
I believe that's right, Jesse. And
Okay.
There was reporting that law enforcement executed those search warrants of the home in September. The owner of the home talked to the press and said that there were cameras. So I assume that video information was downloaded as well. Obviously, we know Teslas have plenty of videos, potentially treasure trove of electronic evidence in this case.
This is interesting, right? We don't know what other footage they have as well. So I think it's an interesting point.
Right? I mean, these are young people. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of text messages and the like. So I'm sure we're going to see a lot of evidence in electronic format in a case like this.
Now, can two things be true at once? Can I say, hey, there's an investigative grand jury being impaneled with the idea of potentially another grand jury being impaneled that would indict someone in connection with Celeste's death or disposal of her body, and at the same time, LAPD allegedly telling TMZ that there's no arrest that's imminent?
Look at Jesse Weber laugh at this question. Could two things be? Hold up. The question was, let me go back, okay? Because I'm like, Lord have mercy. Like, I know everybody's friends, this is the major media, mainstream media, right? They're all friends. They all get along. And that's fine. I like Jesse Weber. Shout out to Jesse Weber and Law and Crime. I don't have an issue with them. But I think it's important to know that this is a job at the end of the day, right? They are going to do what they have to do, to get the information and whatnot. But it's interesting because I almost feel like he's asking the question to try to see if what he thinks about TMZ's statement regarding the frozen and the sources and whatnot. Now, hold up, let me go back a little bit because I want to make sure I capture that question.
I believe that's right, Jesse. And
Okay.
There was reporting that law enforcement executed those search warrants of the home in September. The owner of the home talked to the press and said that there were cameras. So I assume that video information was downloaded as well. Obviously, we know Teslas have plenty of videos, potentially treasure trove of electronic evidence in this case, right? I mean, these are young people. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of text messages and the like. So I'm sure we're going to see a lot of evidence in electronic format in a case like this.
Now, can two things be true at once? Can I say, hey, there's an investigative grand jury being impaneled with the idea of potentially another grand jury being impaneled that would indict someone in connection with Celeste's death or disposal of her body, and at the same time, LAPD allegedly telling TMZ that there's no arrest that's imminent?
Okay. So this is a very loaded question, right? So again, it goes back to his earlier statement. You can have a grand jury, an investigative grand jury, and then you can get another grand jury. So could we potentially be looking at two grand juries? Possibly. And then Jesse asked, and at the same time, LAPD allegedly telling TMZ there's no arrest that's imminent. Okay. How would you answer that question?
That's all potentially true. And again, LAPD first said that David wasn't a suspect, then that he was a suspect. And again, this is all reporting to TMZ.
The LAPD did say that, right? Initially, when all the story was kind of breaking down. He's not a suspect. There was a narrative of the cooperation. I don't think that came from LAPD. I think that came from TMZ, but I think it's important to kind of note that, okay?
suspect, then that he was a suspect. And again, this is all reporting to TMZ and local media outlets.
And they haven't come out, LAPD, and officially said he's a suspect, right?
I think what you want about TMZ, they really have their pulse on things here in Los Angeles. I can give you some inside baseball. Look, you know me, I do a lot of TV. I do TMZ all the time. And sometimes I'll file documents in court here in LA County, and TMZ will get a copy of it before I get my own conformed copy back. I mean,
well, yes, and that is correct, right? The TMZ has their pulse in the LA area, that's fine. But again, and they broke the story. Keep that in mind. They made whatever connections they did. They got in contact with mom, whatever that was. But they didn't tell the people about the grand jury part. So what happened? And is it possible to get a wrong source? Is it possible that you got a wrong source? Yeah, I think it's possible that that can happen too. Two things can be correct at the same time. You can get everything right, and then you could also get a couple things wrong.
That's how on top of it they are. And we do, celebrity filings and the like. So they've broken huge news here. Kobe Bryant's death, they were the first to report that information. So I wouldn't.
Yeah, before the family members found out. Yes, that's true.
Necessarily think, hey, TMZ's reporting it. It's not true. It may very well be true. They have a lot of sources here in LA. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're reporting that David is a suspect is true.
By the way, what is going on with this relationship between the ME and the LAPD? This back and forth about whether or not Celeste's body was frozen or decapitated. I said this when I first was reporting TMZ's reporting. I feel terrible for the family that they have to hear these details, whether they're true or not. But this idea of this tension between, it seems there's something going on here. In your experience, is there a strained relationship? Does it explain why we're seeing, I don't know, miscommunication, two different ideas about what happened to her?
Here's the question is there miscommunication about what we're seeing? Because yes, does it explain why we're seeing, I don't know, miscommunication, two different ideas about what happened to her? Yeah, he's going to answer, yeah, I mean, it is an issue. What is the miscommunication? Because I don't personally think that anybody has put any miscommunication out there. If anything, it's been misinformation, or is it disinformation? One of the two. It's like, are we giving misinformation without the intent to deceive, or disinformation with the intent to deliberately spread false information? And I think that's the thing that I'm trying to understand. And my understanding is that the ME has only made two statements, right? Early on in the case about, Celeste Rivas, and it was very minimal. Okay. Let me see if I could even pull it. The initial statement from the ME was very, very early on. Now, I have the initial statement of the ME, the very first time that the ME ever spoke, right? And shout out to Obsidian, who sent me this. And it basically says, this was the description previously posted to the website when the decedent was a Jane Doe. The decedent was found severely decomposed inside of a vehicle on September 8th, 2025. She appeared to have been deceased inside the vehicle for an extended period of time before being found. We are unable to determine her race and ethnicity. The decedent was wearing a tube top, black leggings, small size. She has wavy black hair. Jewelry includes yellow metal stud earring and yellow metal stud chain bracelet. Apart from this and the information available on the website, no additional details can be disclosed. If you'd like to receive a copy of the report once it's complete, you can log in for your request. All right. So that was one statement. And then the last statement that they made was regarding the security hold that was put on the website about Celeste Rivas. That's the last statement that they made. So there hasn't been miscommunication. LAPD has said what they've said, but that's it. I don't feel like the miscommunication has been from ME or even LAPD. I feel like it's been from media.
Seeing, I don't know, miscommunication, two different ideas about what happened to her?
Yeah, I mean, it is an issue. Just so folks understand, LAPD, obviously, they are employed by the city of Los Angeles. The ME, that is a county employee, also Los Angeles as well. So they don't necessarily work for the same government agency. No. I don't know if the relationship is necessarily strained, but I could tell you, living here, there's a lot of pressure. Look, people think that Los Angeles, it's a violent city. Criminals run amok. And the fact that you have this young girl that was missing for so long, then her body was found in a vehicle and no arrest has been made. It seems like at a minimum, right? Someone tampered with the body, right? They were an accessory after the fact.
It's interesting. He's not acknowledging that there is like tension between these two entities. He's not. But he's talking about the time frame, how it's like taking a while.
or there was some sort of crime committed with respect to her body, even if the death was accidental. And of course, there's also some potential other crimes. We don't know if kidnapping, there's statutory rape, there's sex trafficking, obviously murder. Again, I'm not accusing anyone, but it's surprising that now 2.5, almost 3 months have passed, and not a single person has been arrested for this young girl's death. And a lot of people that are watching, a lot of people that are living here, they're upset, and they think that law enforcement, whether they're overwhelmed, they're just not getting the job done. So I think there is that political pressure on this case, both with respect to LAPD and the ME as well. People want answers, and just
both entities receiving pressure. I can see that. I can see both entities, but just because they can't conclusively have a opinion about, the ME can said undetermined, right? And that could mean many things, but it doesn't necessarily deter anybody from an arrest. It doesn't necessarily deter anybody, LAPD, from moving forward. Okay. Maybe the only holdup is the fact that we have grand juries happening and then possible a second one. I don't know, based on this gentleman's assessment of the situation.
justifiably so, especially the victim's family in this case.
100%. And to go back to something that you mentioned as well, this shouldn't put undue pressure on law enforcement. They have to get right. They have to get it right in every case. But I mean, particularly a high profile case like this, where there are a lot of eyeballs on a lot of expectations, but this security hold that LAPD got on the ME's office, I'm curious your thoughts on this too. I mentioned before, but I didn't read the release that came out from the.
Is it the LAPD that got the security hold, or is it a court order that got the hold? It is the LAPD that requested it, right? And if you go back to the LA Times, and they say it in their article, there are concerns. Okay, there are concerns for witnesses. There are concerns. This is a investigation into a murder, and I'm looking at the article as I'm, talking to you guys, right? The attorney's office said in a statement it could not disclose any information about grand jury proceedings. Okay, that's what they said, and essentially, there's a lot to this. They're concerned for the safety of these witnesses. Okay. We don't know who these witnesses are. And that's why I asked you guys the question yesterday when we were live. We don't know where D4VD's whereabouts is at. And if he's being looked into as a potential suspect or whatever the situation may be, what happened after D4VD, he was on tour, he was informed about a body being found? Did he go straight to Texas? Did he fly somewhere else? Did he go to California? We don't know the in-betweens of this situation even there. So I personally do believe that there are some concerns for possibility of people being at risk. I'm concerned about a safety issue as well for the witnesses. We don't know, right? We really don't.
ME's office when this sealing issue happened. So according to a release from authorities, it says, quote, at 10:54 a.m. on Friday, November 21st, the County of Los Angeles Department of Medical Examiner Department received a court order initiated by the Los Angeles Police Department to place a security hold on medical examiner case number 2025-14252, Celeste Rivas Hernandez. No records or details associated with the case, including the cause and manner of death, and medical examiner report can be released or posted on the website until further notice. The department's mission is to have full transparency with the community by providing information about our cases to empower people to make changes that save lives. Since becoming the department head, I've worked on eradicating the practice of placing security holds on medical examiner cases simply by law enforcement request. The practice of security holds is virtually unheard of in other counties and has not been proven to improve outcomes in the legal system. We are dedicated to serving our community with full transparency. However, the law precludes us from doing so while the court order remains in this case.
This is how I see this happening, right? This is my thought. You had an LAPD, a detective or whatever, email the MEs and say, hey, we need to get this information off the website. The ME pushed back and said, we don't do that. Rarely do we do that. It's not a practice that we do. And the head, this doctor right here, I'm going to call him Dr. O'Day, he's like, no, we don't do that. So this is why they had to go to the extent of getting a court order. And then you have this grand jury, which then further supported the court order, right?
The department previously received a request for security hold from the LAPD on this case on September 15th, 2025. So that's
on the 15th of September. So there was already a concern very early on in this case that there needed to be a hold. But again, they put a request. They said no. Well, if you're not going to do it, we're going to get a court order. And that's why they had to get the court order.
7 days, by the way, after Celeste's body was found, which was denied due to insufficient justification to warrant the hold. The department understands the public's interest in this case and remains committed to transparency when possible. Information will be made available once the court order is lifted. For questions about the order, the court order, timeline, and the law enforcement investigation into this death, you can contact the LAPD. Now, I talked about that statement on a previous sidebar, Nima, but I didn't speak to you about it. Your analysis, your experience in terms of these court orders, these security holds, them being petitioned for, them being granted, and why you might see something like this.
Yeah, again, this is part for the course for LAPD. And again, I used to work for the city of Los Angeles. In addition to being a former federal prosecutor, I was the enforcement director at the LA City Ethics Commission on the top 2 floors of City Hall. And we oversaw all the employees of the city of LA, from the mayor on down. And when it comes to different types of, here in California, it's a Public Records Act request. Obviously, in the federal system, it's a FOIA request. LAPD is very aggressive when asserting the law enforcement privilege, right? So there is a presumption that these documents are public. But it can be the Epstein files. It can be the Celeste Rivas case. If it's an active investigation, we've all heard that term, active investigation. That is an exception to a Public Records Act request. And that's what the LAPD is asserting.
That's interesting, right? It's an active investigation. They're still investigating. So this is why this information is not going to be public.
To try to keep that report confidential. Now, certainly the county and the Emmy, they feel differently. They feel that the documents should be made public. That's typically how it's done in other jurisdictions, right? We regularly get these autopsy reports. Sometimes the family will file different motions to keep it secret. We saw it in for instance, the Bob Saget case and other cases where it's the victim's family that's trying to preserve the privacy. But here it's LAPD, it's law enforcement that's doing it. And it's pretty typical for how they do business.
Now, Nima, before I let you go, I got to ask you the fact that LAPD made mention of this Santa Barbara trip. TMZ had reported this apparent trip that David took. You know, they reported that it was in the spring. People have speculated, okay, was that?
And they got that right. TMZ got that right.
At the timeline when maybe Celeste died or her body was disposed. We don't know for sure. The fact the LAPD has now mentioned the Santa Barbara trip, confirming something of interest to them. They didn't have to say it. They mentioned it. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's important, right? Obviously, Celeste Rivas was not from Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara is in the complete opposite direction for folks that don't know Southern California. It's a couple hours away.
And I think it could have been a coordinated leak to see if anybody in Santa Barbara has information about that trip. Did they see something? Did they hear something? You never know, man. You never know.
From Los Angeles, where David lived and apparently where Celeste Rivas was. So look, it's important. I don't know. Sometimes you throw that out there hoping that people will come forward. Maybe they saw them. There's a lot of people who are watching, a lot of social media detectives in a case like this since the very beginning. People have seen them together. So I wouldn't be surprised that there's a specific law enforcement reason why they put it out there, hoping witnesses come forward with either video or other eyewitness testimony, maybe seeing those two together.
Everything that law enforcement does is very well coordinated. Please note that.
Maybe, just maybe, that's the last time she was alive.
Nima, I really can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on and trying to explain this to us, because this can get complicated. This can get confusing. There is this mixed information, trying to make sense of it. We're lucky to have you. Nima Rahmani, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Of course, Jesse, thanks for having me. Hopefully Celeste Rivas and her family get the justice they deserve very soon.
Absolutely. Well, what do you guys think? Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I have a lot of thoughts still, and we'll probably go live tonight and maybe even talk about that a little bit more. I think that there's movement to this case. It's just not very public for us, and it's not going to be at all, right? Like some of this is just going to be very hush-hush within the LAPD and whatnot. But I honestly think that we're moving in the right direction when it comes to this, and that, you know, these wheels, they move a little bit slowly, but they're getting there. As far as TMZ goes, right? I mean, yesterday they dropped a video that was like completely wrong. It had the title and it said huge grand jury reaches major decision in D4VD. And then come to find out that this was an upload from November 27th and there was no huge decision, at least not public to us, that had been reached. You know, people assume that it was like a new update yesterday when we were live. And that's the thing, is very frustrating, right? Because I think if there's anything that people can take, especially major media outlets, is that people are frustrated with the way in which things are being reported. And sometimes it takes regular people on social media like myself and other content creators that are reporting on this, that, work regular jobs or have experience with certain things, have worked in government or police or whatever, to give you guys a different insight that maybe you might not get, say, from like a TMZ or another big outlet. It seems like people are so detached from just being able to say how things are and just make them what they are and not let it be so crazy and salacious to say that there's a huge major update. No, there wasn't. But I mean, I appreciate this law and crime commentary. I think it gave us a different insight into maybe a couple things to think about from a lawyer perspective and whatnot. Guys, let me know what you guys think in the comments. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye, guys.